You wake in darkness, but you are not alone. Around you, dozens of bodies shift in the glow of a dying fire. Someone coughs. A child murmurs in their sleep. An elder turns over on a bed of woven grass. The smell of smoke clings to everything, mixing with damp earth and animal hides. Every breath, every whisper, every movement belongs to everyone. There are no bedrooms to retreat to, no doors to close, no quiet corner where you can simply disappear for a few precious moments. If you wanted to be by yourself, where exactly would you go? It sounds like a surprisingly modern question, yet it may be one of the oldest problems our species has ever faced. Long before cities, houses, and locked doors, humans were already intensely social creatures. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors survived by staying together. Cooperation found food, protected children, and kept predators at bay. Separation, on the other hand, could be dangerous, even deadly. Living close to one another wasn't a choice. It was the price of survival. And yet, anyone who has ever shared a crowded home, worked in a busy office, or longed for 5 uninterrupted minutes knows there is another side to human nature. We crave connection, but we also crave solitude. We need other people, but we occasionally need freedom from them. That tension still shapes our lives today, raising a fascinating question that archaeology, anthropology, and psychology are only beginning to answer. How did ancient humans find privacy when privacy didn't exist? The answer isn't simply a story about walls, doors, or the invention of houses. It's a story about how the human mind adapted to life in constant company, how entire societies learned to respect invisible boundaries before they could build physical ones, and how one of our deepest psychological needs quietly influenced the evolution of civilization itself. By the time we reach the end of that story, even the simple act of closing your bedroom door may never feel quite the same again. To answer that, we first have to let go of one very modern assumption, that privacy automatically means being physically alone. For most of human history, that simply wasn't an option. Archaeological evidence and studies of ancient hunter-gatherer camps suggest that our ancestors typically lived in small bands of around 20 to 50 people. It wasn't a random number. Groups much smaller struggled to defend themselves, share knowledge, or care for children, while much larger groups became difficult to feed and coordinate. Somewhere in that range, evolution found a balance. Imagine spending every hour of every day with the same handful of people. You woke beside them, gathered food with them, shared meals around the same fire, and slept only a few feet away from them each night. There was no commute to separate work from home, no spare room to cool off after an argument, and no weekend getaway when social life became exhausting. Every emotion unfolded before an audience that knew you better than anyone ever could. That closeness wasn't simply a cultural preference, it was a survival strategy. Hunting large animals demanded teamwork. Gathering enough food required cooperation and constant communication. Children survived because grandparents, siblings, and unrelated adults all shared the responsibility of raising them. Even keeping watch through the night depended on people trusting one another completely. Isolation wasn't freedom. In many environments, it was a genuine risk. Modern hunter-gatherer societies offer a valuable glimpse into how this lifestyle may have felt. While no living community is a perfect window into the distant past, researchers studying groups such as the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of southern Africa, and several indigenous peoples of the Amazon consistently observe remarkably communal ways of living. Daily activities happen together, sleeping areas are often shared, and much of life unfolds in open view rather than behind walls. Individual identity is important, but it exists within an intensely social world where cooperation comes before personal space. Rather than lacking privacy, early humans created it in another way. Before walls ever existed, invisible social boundaries already did much of the same work. Those invisible boundaries are surprisingly familiar because you still rely on them every day. Imagine stepping into a crowded elevator. Everyone knows the other people are there, yet almost no one stares. Eyes drift toward the floor numbers, a phone screen, or some imaginary point on the wall. The silence isn't accidental. It's a shared understanding that although we're physically close, we will pretend to give each other a little psychological space. Anthropologists call this civil inattention, the quiet agreement to acknowledge another person's presence without invading their private world. The term was coined to describe modern urban life, but the behavior itself is almost certainly far older than cities. In small prehistoric bands where everyone could see almost everything, survival depended not only on cooperation, but also on restraint. Knowing when to look was important. Knowing when not to look may have been just as essential. Picture a hunter sitting just beyond the campfire after a difficult day. Others notice him, of course. They know where he is. But unless there is a reason to interrupt, they allow him to remain with his thoughts. A couple walks a short distance from camp to talk quietly. Parents recognize the signal and give them space. Someone grieves, worries, or simply needs a moment alone. Even without walls, the group can choose not to intrude. This kind of privacy existed almost entirely in behavior rather than architecture. Nobody disappeared from sight, yet everyone understood that not every conversation required an audience, and not every emotion demanded commentary. These unwritten rules reduced conflict in communities where relationships could not simply be abandoned. A careless insult, persistent gossip, or constant interference threatened more than hurt feelings. It threatened the trust that kept the entire group alive. Psychologists often describe humans as experts at reading one another's intentions, expressions, and emotions. That ability made cooperation possible, but it also created a new challenge. If everyone notices everything, social life becomes exhausting. Evolution may therefore have favored another skill alongside observation: selective ignorance. Sometimes the kindest, smartest, and most adaptive response was to notice something and deliberately act as though you hadn't. Seen this way, the earliest form of privacy was never a locked door or a hidden room. It was a collective decision to respect invisible boundaries. Long before humans learned to build walls from stone or timber, they were already constructing something far more remarkable: social rules that protected the inner lives of the people standing only a few feet away. For tens of thousands of years, those invisible social boundaries were enough. Then, humanity made one of the most revolutionary decisions in its history. Instead of following food across the landscape, people began making the landscape produce food for them. Around 12,000 years ago, in several parts of the world, groups of hunter-gatherers gradually started cultivating crops, domesticating animals, and settling in permanent communities. This transformation, known as the Neolithic Revolution, changed nearly every aspect of human life. It also changed privacy forever. A mobile camp leaves little behind. You carry only what you can transport, and if someone takes your possessions, the group notices immediately. But once families began storing grain, raising livestock, and building permanent homes, ownership became far more complicated. Suddenly there were harvests to protect, tools to safeguard, and supplies meant to last through the winter. For the first time, people weren't just sharing resources, they were accumulating them. Ownership naturally created boundaries. A field belonged to someone. A storage room held one family's grain rather than another's. The question was no longer simply who you lived beside, but where your responsibilities ended and someone else's began. Privacy was becoming less about temporary moments of solitude and more about controlling access to your possessions, your family, and eventually your personal life. One of the clearest windows into this transformation is the remarkable settlement of Çatalhöyük in present-day Turkey, dating back roughly 9,000 years. At first glance, it hardly resembles a modern town. Houses were packed tightly together like pieces of a giant puzzle, with almost no streets separating them. People climbed ladders onto their roofs and entered through openings in the ceiling rather than front doors. From above, it looked like one enormous interconnected structure instead of hundreds of separate homes. Step inside, however, and a different picture begins to emerge. Archaeologists have uncovered raised sleeping platforms, carefully organized storage areas, dedicated cooking spaces, and places reserved for household rituals. These weren't random arrangements made for convenience. They reveal that people were beginning to think differently about domestic life. Activities that had once blended together in shared camps were now assigned to specific places inside the home. That shift may seem subtle, but it marked the beginning of something profound. Architecture was no longer protecting people only from rain, wind, or predators. It was organizing social relationships, A wall could separate one family from another. A raised platform distinguished where people slept from where they worked. A storage room quietly announced that not everything inside belonged to everyone. In time, those physical divisions reshaped the way humans understood themselves. A house became more than shelter. It became an extension of identity. Crossing a threshold now meant entering someone's world rather than merely standing under the same roof. As buildings grew more sophisticated, so too did the idea that certain parts of life belonged behind walls. Long before laws formally protected private property, architecture had already begun teaching the human mind a new lesson. Space itself could define who was welcome, who was trusted, and what was meant to remain unseen. But even as homes became more private, not everyone experienced that privacy equally. Children rarely did. For most of human history, they rarely experienced anything resembling a private room, a personal corner, or even a space they could truly call their own. Childhood unfolded in full view of the community. Sleeping, eating, learning, playing, and even witnessing the most intimate moments of adult life all happened within shared spaces where very little was hidden. To modern eyes, that might seem overwhelming. Today, we often think of childhood as something carefully protected, with separate bedrooms, age-appropriate conversations, and spaces designed specifically for young people. But prehistoric life followed a different logic. Knowledge wasn't taught in classrooms or behind closed doors. It was absorbed by observation. Children learned how to make tools by watching skilled hands. They discovered which plants were safe by following experienced gatherers. They understood family relationships, conflict, celebration, grief, and cooperation because they saw them unfold every day. Yet children, perhaps more than anyone else, still found ways to be alone. Not through architecture, but through movement. As settlements grew and daily responsibilities expanded, young people were often sent to collect firewood, gather edible plants, fetch water, or watch over small animals. These weren't simply chores. They were moments when the constant presence of the group faded into the background. A familiar trail through the trees, a quiet riverbank, or a rocky hillside became something more than part of the landscape. They became places where a child could think without interruption. Developmental psychologists have long observed that children naturally create what might be called psychological territory. Give them a forest and one tree becomes their tree. Give them a shoreline, and one particular rock becomes a secret fortress known only to them and perhaps a trusted friend. Even in environments where no physical ownership exists, the mind begins assigning emotional meaning to places. This suggests something remarkable about our species. The desire for personal space did not wait for bedrooms to be invented. Long before walls divided homes into private rooms, children were already carving out invisible worlds of their own. Their first refuge was not built from timber or stone, but from distance, imagination, and the simple freedom to wander just far enough that, for a little while, they could hear their own thoughts. Childhood shows how people created privacy without walls. But one everyday activity reveals something even more surprising: going to the toilet. If privacy is truly a universal human need, surely this is where we'd expect it to appear. Surprisingly, the archaeological record tells a very different story. For most of prehistory, there were no dedicated bathrooms. Hunter-gatherers simply stepped away from camp when nature called, choosing a convenient spot before returning to the group. There were no locks, no etiquette manuals, and no expectation that this part of life should be hidden from others. It was simply another daily necessity, no more remarkable than collecting firewood or fetching water. Even after cities emerged, physical privacy remained surprisingly limited. Ancient Rome, celebrated for its engineering achievements, built one of the most advanced sanitation systems the world had ever seen. Aqueducts carried fresh water across vast distances, while public latrines used flowing channels to carry waste away. Hygienically, they were an extraordinary achievement. Socially, however, they would feel deeply uncomfortable to most of us. Roman public latrines were long stone benches with evenly spaced openings, where dozens of people sat shoulder to shoulder with no partitions between them. Friends exchanged news, merchants discussed business, politicians built alliances, and neighbors caught up on local gossip, all while using what we would consider a public restroom. To a Roman citizen, this arrangement was practical rather than embarrassing. The awkwardness exists largely in our own minds because we inherit different cultural expectations. That contrast reveals an important truth about privacy. Embarrassment is not fixed by biology alone, it is shaped by culture. Every society decides which parts of the human body should remain visible, which should remain hidden, and under what circumstances those rules apply. What one civilization considers perfectly ordinary, another may find deeply uncomfortable. As sanitation systems became more sophisticated and homes increasingly included dedicated spaces for bodily functions, attitudes began to shift as well. The bathroom gradually transformed from a communal necessity into one of the most private rooms in the house. In many ways, its evolution mirrors the broader story of civilization itself. As humans gained greater control over their environment, they also sought greater control over who could witness the most vulnerable moments of everyday life. As private spaces became part of everyday life, they also became a symbol of status. Across the ancient world, different civilizations arrived at remarkably similar conclusions, each in its own way answering the same question: who deserves a private life? In ancient Egypt, the answer depended heavily on where you stood in society. Most ordinary families lived in modest mud brick houses where several generations shared only a handful of rooms. Daily life remained highly communal, and many activities blended together within the same space. But step inside the residence of a wealthy official or noble, and the architecture begins telling a different story. Reception rooms welcomed visitors, while deeper chambers remained reserved for family members and trusted servants. Guests were expected to stop at invisible boundaries they instinctively understood. The further into the house you traveled, the more intimate the spaces became. Privacy itself had become something that could be designed, controlled, and displayed. A similar idea emerged in Mesopotamia, but instead of expressing it through architecture alone, Mesopotamian civilization embedded it into law. By the time the Code of Hammurabi was carved into stone nearly 4,000 years ago, the home was no longer viewed as simply a place to sleep. It had become legally protected territory. Entering another person's house without permission was treated as a serious crime because crossing that threshold violated far more than property. It violated the household itself. Civilization had reached a point where walls no longer depended solely on their physical strength. They were reinforced by society's shared agreement that some spaces deserved protection. The Greeks approached the problem from a completely different direction. To them, the greatest measure of a citizen was not what happened inside the home, but what happened outside it. Public life unfolded in the agora, where politics, commerce, philosophy, and debate shaped the identity of the city. Reputation depended on being seen. Honor depended on participation. Yet this celebration of public life made the home even more significant as its opposite. Behind its walls existed a quieter world reserved for family, rest, and intimate relationships. The balance between these two spheres defined what it meant to be a respectable citizen. That balance, however, was deeply unequal. Free men moved between both worlds with relative freedom, while many women were expected to remain almost entirely within the household. The same walls that provided protection also limited opportunity. Privacy, once again, was distributed according to social position rather than universal principle. Even in societies that valued the private home, access to that privacy reflected power. Thousands of kilometers to the east, ancient Chinese thinkers were wrestling with a question that feels strikingly modern. Confucian philosophy recognized that every person occupies different roles throughout life: child, parent, official, friend, ruler. Each role carried its own expectations, rituals, and responsibilities. Public life required careful self-control because social harmony depended upon people performing these roles correctly. But Confucian scholars also understood that constant performance could never reveal the whole person. The household became the place where formal roles softened, where genuine affection could replace ceremony, and where authentic relationships could flourish beyond the demands of public reputation. Privacy was not simply isolation. It was the environment that allowed sincerity to exist. Rome brought many of these ideas together with extraordinary precision. Wealthy Roman homes were deliberately arranged to guide visitors through layers of increasing intimacy. The front of the house served almost as a public office, where clients arrived each morning, business was conducted, and social obligations were fulfilled. Beyond these formal spaces lay dining rooms reserved for invited guests, family quarters shielded from outsiders, and gardens that offered rare moments of quiet within crowded cities. Architecture itself became a language, directing people towards some spaces while quietly telling them they did not belong in others. Despite their enormous differences in religion, politics, and culture, these civilizations all arrived at the same realization. Privacy was never simply about hiding. It was about control. Control over who could enter your home, who could witness your family life, who could interrupt your thoughts, and who had the authority to cross the invisible boundaries that defined your world. By the ancient age, a private space had become more than a refuge. It had become a measure of security, identity, and social power. An idea that continues to shape our lives every time we decide who is, and is not, welcome beyond our own front door. Even after walls grew taller and laws grew stronger, there remained one place no ruler, neighbor, or visitor could fully enter: the human mind. Physical privacy could be taken away. A home could be searched, possessions stolen, or doors forced open. But thoughts, memories, fears, and hopes remained beyond anyone else's reach. In many ways, this became humanity's most important refuge. Ancient people found remarkable ways to protect that inner world. Personal prayers allowed individuals to speak privately with the divine, expressing doubts and desires that might never be voiced aloud. Letters created another kind of sanctuary, carrying thoughts intended for only a single reader. And although personal diaries were far less common than they would become centuries later, private writing gradually offered a space where people could reveal the version of themselves hidden beneath public expectations. Few examples illustrate this better than the Roman statesman Cicero. In public, he projected confidence, authority, and unmatched skill as an orator. Yet, in his private correspondence with his close friend Atticus, a different man emerges, one burdened by anxiety, uncertainty, grief, and ambition. The contrast is striking. Ancient civilizations had already discovered that every person carries two identities: the one the world sees and the one known only to themselves. Long before bedrooms became private, the mind had already become the one place nobody else could truly enter. Looking back across human history, the story of privacy is not the story of walls alone. It is the story of a need that changed its shape as civilization changed around it. Hunter-gatherers found privacy in quiet understanding. Farmers built it into their homes. Kingdoms protected it with laws. Yet it was never shared equally. Wealth, status, gender, and power often determined who could truly be left alone. The next time you close your bedroom door, silence your phone, or steal a few uninterrupted moments for yourself, remember that you are continuing a journey that began tens of thousands of years ago around a crowded prehistoric fire. The faces have changed, the walls have grown stronger, but the quiet hope remains exactly the same: to belong to a community, and, every now and then, to belong only to yourself.